I've worked inside the Vatican for 19 years. 19 years of polished marble and whispered Latin and men who walk like the floor itself might judge them. And in all that time, I can tell you, I never once saw a Swiss guard move when he wasn't supposed to. Not once. So when I tell you that on the morning of the funeral, one of them stepped out of line, just stepped out, like a statue deciding to breathe, I need you to understand what that meant. I need you to feel it the way the rest of us felt it. Because a single step in that place on that day was louder than any cannon. Let me start from the beginning. Let me tell you exactly how it happened, because I was there. I saw the whole thing with my own two eyes, close enough that I could hear him breathing. And 19 years later, well, some things you don't forget, some things follow you home. My name doesn't matter much. I worked in the communications office, the unglamorous part, the part nobody films. I wrote schedules, I translated press notes, I stood at the edges of grand moments holding a clipboard like it was a shield. I was the kind of person who saw everything and was seen by no one. Which, on that particular morning, turned out to be the only reason I had such a clear view. The Pope had died on a Tuesday. I won't go too deep into that part, it's a heavy thing, the death of a man like that, and the whole city seemed to sag under it. The bells rang in a way I'd never heard, slow, tired, like even the bronze was grieving. For days the Vatican didn't sleep. None of us did. There were arrangements to make, heads of state flying in, cardinals arriving from every corner of the earth, their faces grey from the long flights and the longer grief. The kitchens ran day and night. The florists worked until their hands cracked. And through all of it, the Swiss Guard stood. You've seen them, probably. The striped uniforms, blue and red and gold, looking almost like something out of a children's storybook. Tourists love them. Tourists think they're decorative, like the fountains. People pose next to them and make faces, trying to get them to laugh. They never laugh. That's the thing most people don't understand about the Guard. Those uniforms might look like costume. The men inside them are anything but. They are soldiers, real ones, trained, disciplined, sworn. Every one of them has taken an oath to protect the Pope with his own life, and they mean it the way most people only mean things in the movies. Their discipline is a kind of religion all its own. They stand for hours. They don't shift their weight. They don't scratch an itch. They don't turn their heads to follow a pretty girl or a loud noise. I once watched a guard stand through a sudden downpour without so much as blinking the rain out of his eyes. The water ran down his face like he was made of stone, and he let it. So you have to hold that picture in your mind, that stillness, that total inhuman control. Because that's what makes the rest of this story matter. His name was Lukas. I learned that later. At the time, he was just one of the figures in the formation, one of the bright shapes lining the path the coffin would take. But I'd seen him around before, the way you see anyone in a place where you both work for years without ever speaking. A tall young man, big shoulders, quiet even for one of them. There was something about his face, though. I'd noticed it once months before in the courtyard. The other guards had this expression, proud, sealed shut, almost severe. Lukas had that too on the surface, but underneath there was something softer, something that looked, if you caught it at the wrong angle, almost sad. I didn't think anything of it then. You don't, do you? You notice a thing, you file it away, you move on with your little life and your clipboard. It's only afterward that you go back and realize you were looking at the edge of something the whole time. The morning of the funeral came up clear and cold. I remember the cold most of all. It was one of those bright winter mornings where the sky is so blue it almost hurts, and the air has teeth. People had been gathering in the square since before dawn, thousands of them, tens of thousands, pressed together behind the barriers, breathing into their hands, holding candles that the wind kept threatening to take. You couldn't see the end of the crowd. It just went and went, all the way back through the great curving arms of the colonnade and out beyond, into the streets, into the city. People had come from everywhere. Old women with rosaries wound so tight around their fingers the beads left marks. Young families with children half asleep on their shoulders. Priests, nuns, strangers, the famous and the forgotten, all standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold. And the silence. I will never, as long as I live, forget that silence. You don't expect a crowd that size to be quiet. You expect noise, that low ocean roar a big crowd makes even when it's trying to be still. But this was different. This was a held breath, a whole city holding its breath together. The only sound was the bells, and the wind, and every so often somebody weeping softly, the way you weep when you're trying not to. I was positioned near the front, off to the left side, just inside the line of guards, close enough to do my job, whatever small thing my job was supposed to be that day, close enough to see the faces. The coffin was plain. That surprised some people. I think they expected gold, expected grandeur. But it was simple wood, the way he'd wanted it, the way he'd lived. They carried it out into that blue cold and set it on a low platform before the crowd, and the whole square seemed to lean forward as one body. The cardinals took their places. The choir began, and oh, that sound, it rose up into the cold air like something with wings, and the great slow machinery of the funeral started to turn. And the guard stood. Lukas was maybe 20 feet from me, to my right along the path. I could see him in profile, that sealed, severe face, that perfect stillness. The morning sun caught the gold of his uniform and made him glow a little, and I actually thought this, I remember it, I thought, they really are something, aren't they? They really do hold the whole weight of it. I had no idea what was coming. None of us did. Now I have to slow down here, because to understand what happened, you have to understand a little of what came before it. And I only learned this part later in pieces from people who knew him. I've stitched it together as best I can, and I think it's true or close enough to true that it doesn't matter. Lukas came from a small village, the kind of place where the mountains close in around you and the whole world is the church, the school, and a handful of houses leaning into the cold. His family wasn't rich. His father worked with his hands and his mother kept the house, and they were, by all accounts, good people with not very much. He had a younger sister. I want to say that clearly because she matters. A little sister, years younger than him, born when he was almost grown. He adored her. The way an older brother can adore a small child who arrives like a gift late in the day, he would have done anything for her. When she was very young, she got sick. I don't know all the details. I don't think anyone outside the family really does, and it's not my place to put words in a sick child's mouth. But it was serious. The kind of serious where the doctors stop making promises and start choosing their words carefully. The kind of serious that comes into a small house in a small village and never quite leaves, even after. And here is the part that matters. Here is the part that, when I learned it, made my chest go tight. Years before, long before Lukas ever dreamed of putting on that uniform, the man who would one day be Pope had passed through their region. Not as Pope. He wasn't Pope yet then. Just a bishop, traveling, doing the quiet work that doesn't make the news. And somehow, I've heard 2 or 3 versions of how, he ended up at the bedside of a sick little girl in a small house in the mountains. He stayed longer than he had to. That's the part everyone agrees on. He had a schedule, he had people waiting, and he sat with that frightened child and her terrified family for a long, long time. He held the little girl's hand. He spoke to her softly. He made her laugh. Apparently he was good at that, even then, making frightened people laugh. And before he left, he said something to the boy. To Lukas, who was standing in the corner, too big to cry in front of his sick sister, and too young to do anything but stand there feeling useless. I don't know exactly what he said. I've heard it told 3 different ways, and I won't pretend to know the real words. But the shape of it was this: you don't have to be strong all the time. Even the strong are allowed to feel. Something like that. Something a frightened young man would carry for the rest of his life, without ever quite knowing he was carrying it. The little girl lived. I want to say that plainly too, because the story doesn't work if you're sitting there worrying about a child. She lived. She got better. She grew up. By the time of the funeral, she was a young woman with her own life and her own troubles, the ordinary ones, the good kind. But the family never forgot. How could they? A great man had walked into the smallest moment of their lives and made it bearable. That kind of thing doesn't leave you. It plants itself in the soil of a family and grows down through the years. And years later, when that bishop became something far greater, and a boy from a mountain village grew into a tall young man and took an oath to guard him with his life, well, you can imagine. You can imagine what that uniform meant to Lucas. You can imagine that it wasn't just a job. It was the closing of a circle. It was a debt being paid in the only currency he had: his loyalty, his discipline, his life. He never told the Pope. That's what gets me. In all those years standing guard, all those times the man passed within arm's reach of him, Lucas never said a word. Never said, "You came to my sister's bedside, you saved us, you are the reason I am standing here." He just stood. He just guarded. He kept his oath in silence the way he kept everything in silence. And then the man died. So now you know what Lucas knew, standing there in the cold that morning. Now you know what was inside that sealed, severe face while the choir sang and the crowd held its breath. He wasn't just guarding a coffin. He was guarding the man who'd sat at his dying sister's bed and told a frightened boy it was all right to feel. I didn't know any of this at the time, you understand. At the time, he was just a beautiful statue in a gold and blue uniform. But I'm telling it to you now, in the right order, the way I wish someone had whispered it to me that morning. Because then maybe I would have been watching him more closely from the start. Maybe I would have seen it coming. I didn't. The first hour of the funeral passed the way these things do. Slowly, heavily. The prayers rose and fell. The cardinals spoke. Translators murmured into earpieces. The cold crept up through the soles of everyone's shoes and into their bones, and still nobody moved, because how could you move? How could you complain about cold feet when he was lying there in his plain wooden box? I watched the crowd more than the ceremony, truth be told. That was sort of my job, keeping half an eye on things, on the flow of it, on anything that might go wrong. And I watched the guards too, the way you watch something beautiful when you've got nothing else to do with your eyes. Lucas didn't move. Of course he didn't. None of them did. But there was, and maybe I'm only saying this because I know now how it ended, there was something gathering in him. I keep going back to it in my memory. The longer the ceremony went, the more his stillness seemed to change. At the start, it was the stillness of discipline, of training, of a soldier doing his duty. By the end, it was the stillness of a man holding something down with both hands. You can tell the difference if you know to look. The first kind of stillness is empty, calm. The second kind is full to bursting. The second kind is a dam. His jaw was tight. I could see that even from where I stood. His eyes were fixed forward the way they're trained to be, but they had stopped being calm. They'd started to shine, just slightly, just at the edges. I told myself it was the cold. The wind makes everyone's eyes water. That's what I told myself. But somewhere underneath, in the part of me that had spent 19 years learning to read this place, a small voice was starting to whisper, "Something is wrong with that one. Something is happening to that one." And the coffin still had to be carried. That was the moment it would come, I understand now. Not during the prayers, not during the songs, but at the end, when the time came to lift that plain wooden box and carry it on the long, slow walk to its resting place. When it would pass, close, right past the line of men who'd sworn their lives to the man inside it. That was when the dam was going to break. I just didn't know it yet. I was standing there with my clipboard and my watering eyes, cold to the bone, thinking about nothing more dangerous than whether the schedule was running long. And 20 feet to my right, a young man from a mountain village was about to do the one thing his whole life had trained him never, ever to do. He was about to move. The choir stopped. There's a particular kind of silence that comes after music. It's not the same as ordinary quiet. It's a silence with a shape, a silence that still remembers the sound it used to be. The last note rose up over the square, hung in the cold air for a second that felt like an hour, and then let go. And in that letting go, you could feel the whole crowd understand at once. It's time. Time for the coffin to move. I felt it in my own chest before I understood it in my head. A tightening, a drawing in. 40, 50,000 people somehow all leaning forward by the same half-inch, like the tide pulling back before it comes in. The bearers stepped forward. I watched them take their positions around the plain wooden box. Big men, all of them chosen for it. They moved with that slow, deliberate grace you only see at funerals, where every step is its own small prayer. They bent, they gripped, and on some signal I couldn't see, they lifted. The coffin came up off the platform. I heard a sound go through the crowd then, not a word, not a cry, just a kind of collective exhale, a soft "oh" from thousands of throats at once. The sound a person makes when they see something true and unbearable. The coffin rose into the morning light, and the gold of the great basilica behind it caught fire in the sun, and for a moment the whole world was just that, the box, the light, the held breath. And then they began to walk. Now, I want you to picture the path. The bearers had to carry the coffin along a route that ran right between two lines of Swiss guards, two perfect rows of them, facing inward, lining the way like the banks of a river. The coffin would pass down the middle between the rows, close enough on either side to touch. This is deliberate. It's tradition, centuries of it. The guard forms the final honor. The men who swore to protect his life stand witness as his body passes for the last time. It's meant to be the highest expression of their duty, to stand, motionless, perfect, while the man they served is carried by. To stand, that's the whole point. They stand. They do not bow. They do not reach out. They do not weep, or if they weep they do it without moving a single muscle of the face. The honor is the stillness. The discipline is the love. That's how the guard says goodbye, by being more perfectly still than they have ever been in their lives. Lucas was in that line. On the right side as the coffin would approach, about 4 men down from the front. I could see him clearly now. The bearers and their burden were moving slowly toward the gap, toward the rows, toward him. And I was watching him. By now I was watching him completely, my clipboard forgotten in my hand, because that small whispering voice in the back of my mind had grown into something louder, something I couldn't ignore anymore. Something is wrong with that one. His chest was rising and falling too fast. That was the first thing. A guard's breathing when they're locked into the stillness is almost invisible, slow, shallow, controlled. Lucas was breathing like a man who'd been running. Quick, shallow, fighting it. I could see the gold of his uniform lifting and dropping with each breath, faster than it should have, and I thought, he's not going to make it. He's not going to hold. The coffin drew closer. 30 feet, 25. His eyes weren't fixed forward anymore. That was the second thing, and it was worse than the first. A guard's eyes never leave their point. Never. But Lucas's eyes had begun to follow the coffin. Just slightly. Just a flicker, a betrayal of the head he wasn't supposed to let move, but his gaze was on the box now, locked on it, tracking it as it came, and there was something in those eyes I can only describe as drowning. 20 feet. I saw a tear come loose. Just one. It ran down the side of his face, catching the light, and a guard is trained to let it fall, to stand there and let it fall and not so much as blink. And to his credit, to his last shred of training, he didn't move to wipe it. He just let it run. But his hands had started to shake. 15 feet. The coffin was almost level with the front of the line now. The bearer's slow footsteps were the only sound in all that silence, that, and the soft scuff of leather on stone, and somewhere far back in the crowd a child asking a question and being hushed. 10 feet. I remember thinking, with a strange flat calm, he is about to break. I am about to watch a Swiss guard break, right here in front of the whole world, and there is nothing I can do. And then the coffin reached him. It passed in front of him slowly. So slowly. The bearers carrying it level with his chest, the plain wood gleaming, close enough that Lucas could have reached out and laid his palm flat against the side of it. For one whole second he held. I swear he held. Every muscle in him locked down, every ounce of 19 years of training, and a lifetime of debt and grief crushed into one final, desperate effort to stand, to be the statue, to give the man the only gift the guard knows how to give, the gift of perfect stillness. And then he broke. He didn't break the way I expected. I'd braced for collapse, for a man buckling, going down, the spectacle of it. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter than that, and 1,000 times more devastating. He stepped forward. One step, out of the line, out of formation, out of 300 years of tradition, in a single movement so small that for a heartbeat no one even registered it. He stepped out of the perfect row of statues, into the path of the coffin, and he put his hand on it. He laid his hand on the wood. The bearers stopped. They had to. He was in their way, this enormous young man in blue and gold, and they stopped, confused, frozen, because nothing in their training had prepared them for a Swiss guard stepping out of line either. And the whole square went still in a new way, a worse way. The held breath became a held gasp. I felt the crowd seize up around me, felt rather than heard, a vast silent flinch, as 40,000 people realized at the same instant that something was happening that was not supposed to happen. Heads turned. Cardinals looked up. A ripple of alarm ran through the rows of officials. Somewhere behind me I heard a sharp intake of breath, an older voice hissing, "What is he doing? What is he doing?" And Lucas stood there with his hand on the coffin. His head was bowed now. All that fierce trained pride gone, folded down, his chin nearly on his chest, his hand flat and trembling against the plain wood, and his lips were moving. I was close enough to see that. His lips were moving, fast, silent, and I understood that he was speaking to the man inside the box. After all those years of saying nothing, after all those years of standing guard and keeping his thanks locked behind his teeth, he was saying it now. Finally, too late and just in time. Whatever it was, you came to her bedside, you saved us. You are the reason I'm here. Thank you, forgive me, goodbye. I don't know the words, I'll never know the words, but I know what they were made of. Now I have to tell you what was happening in the rest of the square, because it was happening fast, and it was happening all around this one still point of a young man and his hand on a coffin. Chaos isn't the right word. It was too quiet for chaos, but there was a kind of silent earthquake going through everyone whose job it was to keep order. The guard commander, I could see him off to the side, had gone rigid. His face was a thing I'll never forget, pure horror, not anger, not yet, just the bottomless horror of a man watching the unthinkable unfold on the most public stage on earth, with cameras from every nation pointed at it and being utterly unable to stop it without making it worse. Because what could he do? Stride out and drag the boy away, in front of the world, at the coffin? That would be 1,000 times the scandal. He was trapped. Every option was a disaster. So he stood there, frozen, his jaw working, and did the only thing he could do, which was nothing. 2 of the other guards near Lucas had half turned. Their training screamed at them to do something, but what? Pull their own brother out of the line and turn the funeral into a brawl. They hovered, caught, their hands twitching at their sides, their eyes flicking to the commander for an order that wasn't coming. The bearers stood holding the coffin, not knowing whether to walk on or wait. Their arms must have been burning, the weight of it held still in the cold. And the cameras, God, the cameras. I could see the long black lenses swinging toward him from the press platforms. A whole battery of them, refocusing, zooming, and I knew, even in that moment I knew that this image was already escaping, already racing out across the world. A Swiss guard out of line, hand on the Pope's coffin, head bowed, weeping. By nightfall it would be on every screen on the planet. By morning, everyone would have an opinion. But here's the thing. Here's the thing I want you to understand. The thing that took me a long time to understand myself. While all those important people were silently coming apart, while the commander froze and the guards hovered and the cameras swung, the ordinary people in the crowd understood it perfectly. Instantly, there was no confusion in the crowd, no scandalized gasp from the old women with their rosaries, no muttering from the families with sleeping children. They saw a young man put his hand on the coffin of someone he had loved and bow his head and weep, and they knew exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at grief. Just grief. Naked human grief, the kind everyone in that square had come there to feel. He was doing the thing all of them wanted to do and couldn't, because of the barriers, because of the distance, because they were only allowed to watch. He had broken the rule that none of them had ever sworn to keep, and in breaking it he had said, out loud and with his whole body, the thing the whole world was choking on. I loved him, I can't just stand here. I have to touch him goodbye. And so the crowd did not turn against him. The crowd, if anything, and I felt this happen, I felt the temperature of 50,000 people change in a matter of seconds. The crowd was with him. A woman near the barrier started to cry, out loud, not the careful, swallowed weeping of before, but openly, her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. And once she'd started, it spread. It spread through the crowd like warmth through cold water. People who had been holding it in all morning, holding their faces still in their own small imitation of the guard's discipline, suddenly let go. Because he had let go. Because if a Swiss guard could weep at this coffin, then so could they. I heard it rise around me. A sound I'd never heard before and have never heard since. The sound of a whole crowd grieving at once, no longer ashamed of it. Soft, vast, oceanic. Not a wail, just release. The damn Lucas had been holding hadn't only been his own. He'd been holding it for all of them, and when he let it break, theirs broke too. And still he stood there, hand on the wood, head bowed, lips moving. The commander took a step. I saw him do it. Saw the decision cross his face, the awful calculation. I have to end this, I have to restore order. This has gone on too long, and he took one step toward the line. And then he stopped. He stopped because of what happened next. The thing I think about more than any other part of that morning. The thing that turned the whole scene from a scandal into something else entirely. Something none of us had a name for. One of the bearers, an old man. One of the men holding the coffin. His arms surely screaming under the weight, slowly, deliberately, lifted his eyes and looked at Lucas. And nodded. Just once. Just a small, slow nod, as if to say, go on, it's all right. Say what you need to say, he would have wanted you to. And then the old man waited. They all waited. The bearers, who could have shifted the boy aside, who could have walked on through, chose instead to stand there holding that terrible weight and give a grieving young man the time he needed. The commander saw the nod. He saw the bearers wait, and whatever he'd been about to do, he didn't do it. He took his foot back. He let it happen. In a place run by rules older than entire countries, in the most rule-bound square on the face of the earth, every single person who had the power to stop it chose, in that moment, not to. They let the boy say goodbye. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like minutes. It was probably seconds. Time does strange things at the edge of something holy. But I remember the end of it. The exact end, as clearly as I remember anything in my life. Lucas lifted his head. He took his hand off the coffin slowly. Like it cost him something to do it, like the wood had become the last warm place in the world and he was leaving it behind. He straightened up to his full height, and then, with his face streaming, with tears running freely down into the high collar of that gold and blue uniform, he did the thing that finished me. The thing that made my own eyes spill over at last, clipboard shaking in my hand. He saluted. Not the loose, broken gesture of a man falling apart. A salute, crisp, perfect, textbook. The most correct salute I have ever seen a human being give, snapped out with absolute precision by a man who was weeping like a child. As if to say, I broke, I'm sorry I broke, but I am still your soldier, I am still on duty. This was the last order I will ever give myself, and it was to honor you properly, the only way I know how. He held the salute. And then, I will never forget this, he stepped back. Back into the line, back into formation, back into the perfect row of statues, sliding into his place as though he had never left it, his arm coming down, his eyes fixing forward, his face going still again even as the tears kept falling down it. The statue reassembled, the guard restored. And the bearers, seeing him return to his post, took a breath and walked on. The coffin moved again, down the path, between the rows, carrying the man inside it toward his rest, while the whole square wept openly now, no longer pretending, and one young guard from a mountain village stood frozen and perfect in his place, with a wet face turned to stone, having said the only goodbye that mattered, having broken the one rule that could not be broken, having given the only thing he had left to give. I stood there with tears on my own face and my forgotten clipboard hanging from my hand, and I thought, I will never see anything like that again, not if I live 100 years. And I was right. But the story wasn't over, because a thing like that doesn't just end when the coffin moves on. A thing like that has consequences. By that evening, the whole world had seen it. By that evening, everyone, the church, the press, the commander, the crowd, and a young man who just done the unthinkable had to decide what it meant. And what they decided surprised everyone. It surprised me most of all. By the time the sun went down, the whole world had seen it. I want you to understand how fast that was. The coffin had barely been laid to rest before the image was everywhere. Every channel, every screen, every phone in every pocket in every country. A still photograph mostly, the one the cameras had caught at the exact moment his hand touched the wood and his head bowed. A young man in blue and gold, breaking, with the plain coffin beside him and the great basilica burning gold behind. You couldn't get away from it. I went home that evening exhausted, hollowed out, the way you get after a day that takes something out of you that doesn't come back, and I turned on the television just to have noise in the room, and there it was. His face, that moment, over and over. And here's what I braced for. Here's what I genuinely expected, knowing the place the way I knew it. I expected outrage. I expected the commentators to line up and say what a disgrace it was. What a breach. What a failure of discipline. I expected words like scandal and humiliation and unforgivable. I expected old men in expensive suits to shake their heads on camera and talk about 300 years of tradition thrown away in a moment of weakness. I expected the church to distance itself, to apologize, to promise an inquiry. I expected, somewhere in a stone office in the Vatican, a young man's career, and maybe his whole life's meaning, quietly coming to an end. That's not what happened. What happened was the opposite, and it happened so completely that it took my breath away. The world did not see a disgrace. The world saw the only honest thing that had happened all day. While everyone else performed their grief with the proper faces and the proper distance, this one young man had simply felt it, out loud, with his whole body, and people were starving for that. They'd been starving for it for days, watching the careful ceremonies and the controlled faces, and here finally was someone who couldn't hold it in, and it broke something open in everyone who saw it. The phrase that started going around, I heard it that very night, and then for weeks after, was something like he grieved for all of us. That's what people kept saying. He did what we all wanted to do. He said what none of us could say. He reached out and touched the goodbye that the rest of us only got to watch from behind a barrier. By morning, he wasn't a scandal. He was something close to a symbol. And the strangest part, the part I still turn over in my mind, is that nobody even knew his name yet. The story of his sister, the bishop at the bedside, the debt of a lifetime, none of that was public. All anyone knew was the image. A faceless young guard weeping, his hand on a coffin. And it was enough. People didn't need the backstory to understand it. Grief doesn't need a backstory. They saw a human being love someone, and that was the whole story right there. But inside the walls, of course, it was more complicated. Because rules are rules, and an oath is an oath, and a man had broken formation at the most sacred moment in front of the entire world. The court of public opinion is one thing. The guard is another. The guard runs on something deeper and older than what the public thinks, and the public doesn't get a vote on it. So the question that hung over everything in those first days was simple and brutal. What happens to Lucas? I heard the whispers. Everyone did. There were those, and I won't pretend there weren't, who wanted him gone, who saw the breach in nothing but the breach, who said that if you let one man step out of line, even for the most beautiful reason in the world, then the line means nothing, and a guard that means nothing can't protect anyone. There's a logic to that, a cold logic, but a real one. Discipline only works if it's absolute. Make an exception for love and grief, and where does it stop? And there were those who said the opposite, who said that a man who could feel that deeply and still pull himself back into formation and give a perfect salute through his tears was not a man who'd failed his discipline. He was a man who'd shown the truest discipline there is. Anyone can stand still when they feel nothing. It takes a kind of strength. Most of us don't have to feel everything and still come back to your post. The commander, the one I'd watched freeze in horror that morning, was the one everyone was waiting on. It was his call more than anyone's. And for a few days, nobody knew which way he'd go. I'll tell you what I learned about that. Not from gossip, from someone who was actually in the room. They called Lucas in. Of course they did. There had to be a reckoning, whatever it turned out to be. And he went in expecting the worst. He'd already decided, I was told, that he wouldn't fight it. He'd broken the oath in his own mind, plainly and publicly, and if they wanted to send him home in disgrace, then that was just, and he would accept it. He went in ready to take off the uniform. The commander was sitting at his desk, and for a long moment, the story goes, he didn't say anything at all. He just looked at this young man standing at rigid attention in front of him, this young man who had caused him the worst moment of his career, who had made him freeze in front of the entire world, and he was quiet. And then he asked one question. He asked why. Not as an accusation, just why. He genuinely wanted to know, why did you do it? You of all of them, you who I'd have called the most disciplined man in the line. Why? And so Lucas told him. He told him about the small village in the mountains, and the small house, and the sick little sister. He told him about the bishop who'd stayed too long at a child's bedside, who'd held a frightened girl's hand and made her laugh, who turned to a useless, terrified boy in the corner and told him that even the strong are allowed to feel. He told him the little girl had lived. He told him that he'd carried that for his whole life, that the uniform had never been just a uniform to him, that every single day he'd stood guard, he'd been standing guard over the man who saved his family, and that he had never, not once in all those years, found the courage to say thank you. And that when the coffin came past him, he understood that it was the last chance, the very last one, that if he didn't say it then, he would never say it, and he would carry the silence to his own grave. So he stepped forward, and he said it, and then he came back. The room was quiet for a while after that. And then the commander, this hard man, this man whose whole life was the rules, the commander stood up, came around the desk, and he didn't say you're dismissed, and he didn't say you're forgiven either, because that wasn't his to give. What he said, I'm told, was something like this. He said, in 30 years I have trained men to stand still no matter what. I always believed that was the hardest thing a man could do. Today you showed me there is something harder. You showed me a man can feel everything, do the one thing his heart demands, and still find his way back to his post. I do not know if what you did was right, but I know it was not weak. Go back to your duties. And that was it. Lucas kept his uniform. He didn't become famous, not really. Not in the way you might think. He didn't go on television. He didn't give interviews. The guard isn't built for that, and neither was he. The image of him went around the world, but the man himself just went back to work, back to standing, back to the long cold hours and the perfect stillness. I saw him a few weeks later in the courtyard, same as ever. Same sealed face, same proud posture, same statue carved out of discipline. If you didn't know, you'd never have guessed that this was the man, that this was the one the whole world had wept with. But I knew, so I looked at him a moment longer than I should have, and he must have felt it because his eyes flicked to me just for a second, breaking nothing, just a glance, and there was something in them. Not pride, not shame, something quieter than both, something at peace. He'd said his thank you. After all those years, he'd finally said it, and it had cost him everything he was supposed to be for about 10 seconds in front of the whole world. And it had been worth it. I think about that morning more than I think about almost anything else from my 19 years in that place. All the grand ceremonies, all the famous faces, all the history I stood at the edge of with my clipboard, and the thing that stays, the thing that won't leave me, is one young man's hand on a plain wooden box. People always want to know what the lesson is. We're trained to look for lessons, aren't we? Like every story has to hand you a tidy little coin at the end that you can put in your pocket. I'm not sure it works like that, but if you pushed me, I'd say this. We spend so much of our lives standing still, holding it in, keeping the proper face, keeping the proper distance, keeping the line. We tell ourselves that's strength. We tell ourselves the people who fall apart are the weak ones, and the people who hold it together are the strong ones. And then once in a while, you watch a man who has spent his whole life being the strongest, most disciplined, most controlled version of himself there is. You watch that man, of all people, step out of the line and lay his hand on a coffin and weep in front of the world. And you realize you had it backwards the whole time. The strength wasn't in the stillness. The strength was in the stepping forward. The strength was in deciding that some things matter more than the rules and being willing to pay for it. And this is the part that gets me, this is the part I'll carry to my own grave, being willing to step back into line afterward and salute and carry on. He broke the protocol. Everyone agreed on that. It was a rare thing, a shocking thing, a thing that sent its tremors through every stone of the Vatican. But I don't think he broke anything that morning. I think he was the only one who didn't. I've never told this story all the way through before. Not like this. People ask me when they find out where I worked, did you ever see anything amazing in there? And I usually just smile and say something about the architecture. But now you know. So if you ever find yourself standing in some perfect, frozen line, keeping it together, holding it down, doing what you're supposed to do while something inside you is screaming to break, I want you to remember a young man from a mountain village, in a uniform of blue and gold, on a cold, bright morning in front of all the world. He felt it all. He stepped forward. He said the thing he'd waited his whole life to say. And then he came home. That's not weakness. That's the bravest thing I ever saw.